According to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been over 200 mass shootings, defined as 4 or more people injured or killed in the United States in 2022 alone.
We need to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And if we can't ban assault weapons, then we should raise the age to purchase them from 18 to 21. Strengthen background checks, enact safe storage law and red flag laws. Repeal the immunity to protect gun manufacturers from liability. Address the mental health crisis. Address the mental health crisis. Address the mental health crisis.
There are an estimated 393 million civilian-owned firearms in the U.S., and there are 20 million AR-15 style weapons in the country.
It's a nasty truth, but those who seek to inflict harm are not fazed by gun control laws. I happen to know this from personal experience.
I'm a gun owner. You know, I don't mind that you know that I have a gun. You can come in my house and look for it. You can get off whatever you need. I don't understand why anyone objects to getting rid of automatic weapons. Automatic weapons, they're not for hunting. They do nothing. They're only there to kill.
You can't have a bunch of people walking around with guns. I used to tell people when we did Bosnia, Kosovo, anything like that, you get enough people with weapons around and there will be unintended consequences.
Difficulty is background checks. I don't object to background checks. And you say, well, why don't we close the loophole of the private transactions? See, they did that in California. They closed the loophole, and it's illegal to have a private transaction. Yeah. But in San Bernardino, it still happened. Why? Because in order to police private transactions and have background checks, you would have to know where all the guns are all the time. And so what we fear is not the registration. I think you'll find this from most pro-gun people. We don't fear the background checks. We fear that you would have to register all guns in order to know if to have a background check.
I'd rather die than be a slave to thee. Don't treat me this way. I'd rather die than be your slave. I will survive. Can you feel my rage? It's not a question of being brave. I'd rather die than be your slave.
I am smaller and less capable to handle violence, and a firearm is the great equalizer. I go to bed at night comfortably and do not worry about it at all because I have an AR-15 beside my bed.
In 1994, an assault weapons ban prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and possession of specific military-style firearms went into effect.
In the words of Thomas Jefferson, he said that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. And among those rights is our right to defend ourselves, defend our family, and to defend our property.
To tell them this is not about gun control, it's about crime control.
As that the guy was simply going to walk around, take aim, pull the trigger, go to the next person, take aim, pull the trigger. He was executing people. When I did realize it, I thought, I've got him. I've got this guy. I reached for my purse that was on the floor next to me, realized I had a perfect place to prop my arm. He was up, everybody else in the restaurant was down. And then I realized that a few months earlier, I had made the stupidest decision of my life. I had begun leaving my gun out in my car because I did what most normal people would do. I wanted to be a law-abiding citizen. I didn't want to get caught with a gun and maybe lose my license to practice.
Urge my colleagues in the House and Senate to act. We can ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in this country once again.
If we sacrifice our liberty in the pursuit of safety, we'll lose our safety and our liberty.
So You may think that I was angry at the guy that did it, but the truth is that's like being mad at a rabid dog. You don't be mad at a rabid dog. You take it behind the barn and you kill it, but you don't be mad at it. But I've got to tell you, I was mad as heck at my legislators because I honestly believe that they legislated me out of the right to protect myself and my family.
The Constitution does not say that government shall decree the right to keep and bear arms. The Constitution says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Due to the graphic nature of this program, listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is the V Radio and Liberty Unleashed radio show. I am the host of Liberty Unleashed, Brian.
And I am the host of V Radio, Neil Kiernan.
All right. Well, this is a great show today, Neil. I'm very excited about it. This is something that I'm very passionate about. If you couldn't tell by the opening, we're obviously doing a show about gun control and the Second Amendment. And, you know, like I said, this is something that I've been very passionate about and very excited to do the show.
I've been very passionate about this issue too, and I think that it's interesting, particularly for me being a left-leaning guy who was always the pro-gun left-leaning guy. Like, where does that come from, right? But, you know, it was imparted on me from my childhood by my mom, you know, that, you know, nope, you need to have your guns, and it's not just for hunting.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I mean, you know, as we get into it, that's part of the conversation that everybody talks about. I think you heard it in the opening. What's her name saying that, you know, machine guns aren't for hunting, and it's not just about hunting. You know, the conversation about gun control isn't new. It's ongoing, obviously, and the dialogue changes a little, but the end goal is the same. It's about control, and I would say eventually an all-out ban.
Right. Yeah, and I think also we need to discuss just the notion that, like, one of the angles that I'm going to bring to this, ironically, and once again, I'm not a communist, but even Karl Marx recognized that the people needed to be armed to be able to protect themselves from any form of tyranny that might take place, which is probably going to be mind-blowing to some people. And it's funny because the Marxist community does its best to try to reinterpret or to, you know, add context to what Karl Marx said. But Karl Marx was very direct. He said that, you know, that any attempt to try to disarm the people should be stopped by force if necessary. And it's interesting that even people as far left as you get still believed that the common man needed to be armed to be able to protect themselves from, if necessary, their own government.
Unless you're in the far left in America, then you seem to be completely for controlling the guns and eventually banning them. So it appears. I mean, you know, one, I want to encourage everybody real quick to go over and, if they haven't already, to subscribe to our channels. My channel is at Liberty Unleashed TV on YouTube, and I believe you're at V-Radio on YouTube.
Yep, and they can also find Johnnie Walker Dread's channel. I put them all in the description, but that's all over on YouTube. But we will make sure that those links are available to you guys. Johnny won't be joining us until a little later. He's doing some research for his own broadcast that'll be going on tonight. You know, but it'll be a great conversation.
Yeah. And, you know, no matter where you stand on the issue today, I hope that you tune in and listen. I mean, if you're against guns and for gun control, I don't suspect that I'll change your mind or will change your mind, but hopefully we'll give you something new or different to think about when it comes to that, and perhaps maybe change your mind, but I doubt it, you know, but we'll try.
Unfortunately, yeah, the gun control thing has become so tribal. I mean, just like pretty much anything else, you know, and I think that if anything, the Kyle Rittenhouse situation did a fantastic job of kind of putting it on display and bringing it back into the common parlance. But one of the things that we will also be discussing today is some examples of some mass shootings, you know, and how they went differently based upon whether or not there was an armed person present.
Right. And, you know, the Kyle Rittenhouse thing, I think, kind of proves the point on gun control all around. You know, the facts were there. If you watch the case, all the well, you know, some facts were there, most of the facts were there. But what I'm saying is you still have people who watch the case and still make claims that, one, Kyle took the gun across state lines illegally, or he illegally owned a gun, even though that came out in the case and it was completely thrown out and wasn't even part of the trial because he didn't do anything illegal when it came to having that gun. And you got one side who still claims after watching everything that Kyle's a murderer, and another side who essentially says, he's a hero. And then we both sides watch the same trial, watch the same footage. So, the same thing happens with the gun control debate all around. I mean, it doesn't seem to matter. You either believe that you have a right to own a gun and a right to defend yourself, defend your property, or you believe you don't. I mean, that seems to be the case here.
Right. I agree. And that's a topic that, I think that we'll definitely be tackling today. I guess, where did you want to start?
Well, I mean, we'll go down here and we've got plenty of stuff to talk about. To me, it's no surprise that government itself is for gun control. No government wants its citizens to be able to challenge its power and the authority. That's always going to be the case. What really does surprise me, Neil, and hopefully there's some people in the chat that might spread some light on this for us. But what really surprises me is the amount of people who go along with the government, who hear what some of the politicians are saying, and agree with it and think that we should have some form of control. And now with social media, I mean, it's just like our last episode where everything's more loud, more vocal because of social media. And what I find is, our last episode where we talked about the book banning, we just talked about how it's a straight out lie, that the one side, the left, is sitting there saying they want to ban books, they want to ban books. And now what the left does, particularly with guns, is it's the guns, Neil. It's the guns. That's all they say. It's the guns. Anytime there's a shooting, they come out and say it's the guns. And then they follow up and say, this is the fault of the NRA and extreme MAGA Republicans. They don't talk about the actual shooter or blame the shooter. They blame the guns, they blame the NRA, and they blame the Republicans. And they do it often and loudly, and that's repeated. It's on repeat. They don't change. You go in and you watch the comments, the amount of people who suggest to them think otherwise, and they don't change their position. It's the guns, it's the guns, it's the NRA. The NRA has blood on their hands. And I mean, incidentally, I don't really know any NRA members. I've been a gun owner since I was 13, 14 years old. And what I can tell you is the NRA is going downhill. They've spent too much time compromising with politicians on gun control, that there are much better gun advocacy groups out there than the NRA. So the fact that, that the left is yelling it's the NRA, it's kind of interesting to me, but it's on repeat.
Right. And, repeat the lie often enough and you can create a consensus. And I think that largely at the end of the day, a lot of the people who, for one thing, this is one of the reasons why it's a problem, is that these same people want to defund police departments, and I know that, for example, obviously as an anarchist, you want to do the same thing, but society has to be prepared for it. But if you're going to defund police departments, as we've already seen, that isn't working out in the places that it's being done that are definitely not prepared for any such kind of a movement. Crime rates are going up, violent crime rates are going up, victimizations are going up, and places like Chicago that have the most stringent gun laws, as a city, for some reason end up with the highest crime rates regardless. And that's because criminals don't usually get their guns through legal means anyway.
Right, exactly. I mean, I have a graphic here of two gang members, and I don't know if you can put that up on the screen there, but it's
there we go.
I mean, it says it all. It says, it's the one guy saying, "Are you coming to the drive-by tonight?" And the other gang member says, "Can't, still waiting on my gun permit." Right. Yeah, like that happens. The only people who are affected by those waiting lists and the gun permits and things like that are the law-abiding citizens who are trying to protect themselves. There was a case recently that came across, and I couldn't find it again for the show, so I'll just sum it up for you. But this lady was in California, had a stalker. The stalker seemed like he was going to get violent, and she went to apply for a handgun, and I guess she had to wait 10 days. Right. Now, a lot can happen within that 10 days. The only person that's affecting is her. The stalker doesn't care. In fact, he's probably happy that she has to wait 10 days. So yeah, the criminals, they don't follow the laws. They don't care about the laws. And I think it's a common theme when you go and watch the comments on social media. All the Democrats out there screaming, it's the guns, and we've got to do these regulations. And everybody says, well, okay, that's affecting me, the law-abiding citizen. How's that going to stop crime? and it's like silence. They don't respond back to the comments. There's no video or anything I can find where they rationally tell you how that will stop crime. They claim that Clinton's assault rifle ban, which we'll get into, wasn't even really in a ban, as we go through the show, but they claim that during that period that gun crime really plummeted. When you look into it, there's no actual data or study that shows that to be true. But yet again, they're on repeat. We banned assault rifles once and it stopped crime. We can do it again.
Right, and as if like that's even the weapon that the majority of the crimes are even being committed with. I mean, we could look at statistics for that at some point for sure, but in general, while they did happen, I mean, I remember the AK-47s sounding off when I lived in the ghetto, but most of the crimes I'm pretty sure were done with pistols. You might know more about that than me.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the case when you look at the stats and go through it. And that's what I find interesting, that they're sitting there running around saying, we need to ban assault rifles. We need to ban assault rifles. They're like, we're all about protecting you and the children, so we need to ban assault rifles. Assault rifles, as they describe them, as they try to, with their categorizing, the AK or the AR, specifically the AR, is used in less than 3% of the gun shootings and gun crimes out there. So, they want to ban this thing that's not even really being used. And of course, they're ignoring the pistols. And I assume that has to do with the DC versus Heller case, because the Supreme Court already ruled on that based on, him wanting to buy a pistol. But that's the thing. Like, they're not telling the truth. Again, it's a flat out lie to push an agenda. And that's it. They don't care about the stats unless the stats support their argument. And even then, they take the stats and they skew the stats. So, what you're hearing right now through the president all the way down through Congress and their supporters is that guns are the number one killer of children. Well, first of all, children generally don't die of terminal illness, not in numbers, because they're young and healthy. So, of course, cancer and heart disease aren't going to be a high killer of children. Most children aren't smoking, or doing drugs. So, you can eliminate that. They're not drinking and driving because they can't drive. So there's very few things that are going to be a killer of children. But if you take that stat and you break it out, first of all, they include 18 and 19-year-olds in that stat of children. And most of those 18 and 19-year-olds are killed due to gang violence.
Right. And they're very selective about their outrage when these kinds of things happen, too. And it's always interesting to see this, is that the left is highly concentrated, for example, on the very few people of color who are killed by police every year who are unarmed. I did a video on that topic, and I believe it was literally 19 total in 2019 unarmed Black people shot. A number like, of course, when you look at it, on average, the police only shoot about 1,000 a year. And of that number, there was 13 in 2019. And the 1,000 a year is not a number adjusted for justified shootings. And you have to take that into account, the millions and millions of police interactions. And I have all those statistics if people want to read them, but it's actually not very common in the long run, and certainly not common enough to try to suggest that needs to be the primary focus. But in the meantime, they don't want to discuss any of the other crime that's going on in those communities. Like children getting shot, for example, in drive-by shootings, as a consequence, happens considerably more often than people being shot by police.
Right. And, if we're talking about stats, and, my first question becomes, do stats, if the stats are at a certain number, are we allowed to then violate people's rights? And if that's the case, wouldn't that be across the board with all rights, not just the Second Amendment right? And where does that number start and begin? As I said, they run around saying it's the guns over and over. In 2021, over 13,000 people died due to alcohol impaired driving. I have a feeling that if they reported on the news and talked about it as like they do gun violence, maybe people would start saying it's the cars, it's the cars, it's the cars. But they don't. If the news comes out and says, well, this guy was drinking and driving and hit a bus full of children and killed them all, then everybody says, man, that guy was an asshole. What kind of jerk does that? It's the cars. We need to do something about the cars. Take that
Right.
same thing and somebody goes and shoots up a school bus and kills all the children. It's the guns, it's the guns, it's the guns, and they don't talk about the shooter. So they're purposely switching how they talk about things. And again, obviously 13,000 deaths from a car is still less than what the gun violence was in 2021. But I shouldn't say gun violence, because the gun stat includes suicides, and the suicides was 50%, 53% of gun-related deaths. So actual murder and homicide was less than 50% of all gun-related deaths. So when you take the number of gun-related deaths and you take out the suicides and just do gun violence, gun crime, murder, that number goes down significantly to as much or little or as less as car DUI accidents. Right. So again, here we are saying, well, we got to do something about guns, but nothing about cars. Now, I'm not advocating that we do anything about cars. That's not my point here. We could, you could put governors in cars. You could put all kinds of tracking devices on cars. You could do background checks and not let violent criminals drive a car. There's a lot of things that you can do to have common sense, quote unquote, car control laws. Okay. But we don't. And then when you bring it up, most people are like, well, yeah, but we have a right to drive, as if you don't have the right to own a gun. Do you understand? So they're confusing where the rights are. Obviously, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about transportation. There's no Bill of Rights that says your right to have transportation shall not be infringed. Now, I think we believe that that's understood as free people. We have a right to travel around. Right. But nonetheless, the right there to own, keep, and bear arms should not be infringed. And yet that's what's being infringed. And they're trying to do it based on certain numbers. Or so they say. It's probably more agenda, and they try to use the numbers to push that agenda. But you get my point. If you take that same year of 2021, Neil, 98,000 people, that's double gun crime or gun deaths. That would include also suicide. 98,000, almost 100,000 people died of drug overdoses.
Right.
Okay. Clearly, the war on drugs, as we know, is a failure.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this plenty of years ago when we used to do a radio show together. I believe there was a big documentary out about that you were pushing and talking about then. I don't remember the name of it. I was hoping you did.
Actually, it was called the Last Great White Hope: America's War on Drugs, and I interviewed the filmmaker of that documentary. If you guys would like to listen to the interview, you can find it in my archives here on YouTube, because I turned it into a YouTube video as well. I was personally on the fence, but I was 100% convinced about how to handle the war on drugs until I watched that documentary. And he traveled the world looking at the way that the war on drugs was handled in other countries. I think one of them it's one of the Nordic countries. I think it might have been Sweden, but basically, it took them forever to find even a single crack user who was enthusiastic. And then most of the time, though, the drug use was lower in those countries because they handled it as a public health issue rather than as a restriction. That's also what Senator Mike Gravel said for the longest time, that we needed to end the war on drugs.
Right. I think Portugal had the same thing. They started basically, you could go to a clinic and get free needles, so they were clean. So one, it really dropped the HIV and oh God, what's the other one I'm thinking? I can't think of it. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank right now on the air. That's great. Hepatitis. Mm-hmm. So by giving out clean needles and letting people go get the needles without repercussion and getting them clean, making sure that they're clean needles, it dropped those rates significantly. And interesting enough, the argument in America has been, if you legalize drugs, then everybody's going to go out and do drugs. Right? So that's what the same argument. So if you legalize machine guns, as they're trying to say should be illegal, then everybody's just going to go out and get a machine gun and start killing people. It doesn't work that way. You legalize drugs, people who didn't do drugs before aren't going to be like, well, now I'm going to go do them. It's not work that way. And people don't go kill people just because they have a gun. They have to have something else going on with them and in their mind to do that. So, and also, as we're talking about it with the stats, brought up the DUI, that doesn't include the stats of people killed because of distracted driving, which adds a lot more numbers to the death with cars.
Sure.
So texting and driving, putting makeup on and driving, people trying to read a book and drive, you add all that into, and there's still no outcry. And it's because the news and the media do not put it on there and throw it in your face and spend a week talking about it like they do any gun crime.
Right. Yeah, it definitely doesn't get the attention, and I think that it largely just has to do with the fact that they really want to control the way people think about this topic. I mean, not just this topic, but many of them. And at the end of the day, ironically, the same kinds of people who, like I mentioned earlier, they want to take guns away from private citizens, and at the same time, they want to let criminals back out on the streets, literally the same day that they assaulted people. The perfect storm that the progressive left of its current, bastardization is trying to create would literally just create a circumstance that empowers criminals. And going back to the Rittenhouse situation, that was kind of the energy that they seemed to have, was that they always talked about how he should not have been there. He should not have had a rifle. He should not have been armed. And as I just went over in a stream, because I did a stream reacting to the Destiny Young Turks debate, there were armed people present already. There were people with AR-15s shooting at police Bearcats present in Kenosha.
Right. These armed people weren't for the side of the citizens protecting buildings, protecting property. They were on the side of the protest.
Right, exactly. The riots, and they were instigating directly with police and trying to, so the point is like, why would anybody want to be armed to go into that protest? The real question would be, why the hell would you be insane enough to show up to something like that and not be armed?
Right. And let's not forget that he was there, one, giving medical treatment to people, and two, he was helping protect somebody's business. We have the right to protect our life and our property. And since we have that right to form a militia, he had that right to be there with other people to help protect that person's property. And it's overlooked, and they don't want to talk about it. They don't even want you to point it out. And if you do bring it up, they kind of be like, they go back to just saying, well, he shouldn't have been there. I believe that same video you were talking about, they brought up his mother and how bad of a person she was for dropping him off there.
Right.
I guess it turned out she didn't drop him off there, but that didn't change it. He still talked as if his mother did. He didn't change his opinion on that.
Yep. And Johnny's actually signaling that he's ready to join us. You ready to bring him on?
Sure.
All right. So adding to the stream, welcome, Johnnie Walker Dread. Though I can't hear you.
Hey, sorry about that. The little chat thing covered over the actual button to unmute. So I couldn't figure out where it was.
Well, welcome to the show, man. I know obviously two topics that you're, into, the Kyle Rittenhouse topic and how it pertains to the Second Amendment. I mean, that's even why your channel exists, right?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, it started out as a police brutality channel, but I only had a couple of videos up, and I was kind of getting a little bit tired of it at that point. And then all of a sudden, Kyle went around shooting up the town of Kenosha, and that kind of changed everything. And I got really heavily invested. I watched him in the police station, obviously coming unglued, and I thought, I better research this a bit more and see what I can do. And that's what started it all.
Right. And that's actually how Johnny and I met. Was like, ironically, I was the left-leaning guy who had kind of been expecting at some point somebody to go crazy and start shooting people. But I think what brought me to that idea was watching that guy get kicked in the head by Marquis Love, I think the guy's name was. Black Lives Matter security, quote unquote, was following around random white people and it's starting fights with them. And that's all on video. Drew Hernandez did a very good job of uncovering that. But when you watch that guy get kicked in the head, you're like, somebody's going to get shot. So this isn't going to be allowed to go on forever. And then within like 2 weeks that happened. And then I did my own research and went, nope, that's not what happened. People attacked him and he fired back, as in nobody went crazy and was shooting their gun, at least not Kyle Rittenhouse anyway. But we've been over that a lot on this channel, and I know you have on yours. And Brian and I have talked about this topic quite a bit as well. But the reason that it's relevant to what we're discussing today is the right of the private citizen to be able to protect themselves and their property. And I remember over and over again in videos where I was arguing with different people on this topic was that Wisconsin law made it clear that you are allowed to protect yourself a third party, and the third party's property. That's all listed in Wisconsin law, along with your own, obviously. So, as far as the deadly force, you're only supposed to do that in the event that you're being attacked. But you have every reason to believe that you're under attack of deadly force when some idiot fires off a pistol behind you at the same time that somebody's charging you and reaching for your gun. You know, but go ahead.
Oh no, I was agreeing with you. Quickly, Stargazer in the chat asked if it's legal to form a militia. I'm not sure if that was a serious question, but I mean, obviously it is. That's the first part of the Second Amendment, and yes, you can form a militia by definition without a problem. But yeah, we didn't get into state laws. We're basically, as we started off the show, and you were pointing out the Wisconsin law. Yes, every state has their own constitution and laws about guns. In some cases, obviously, that if the gun violates the Constitution, that law violates the Constitution. If it gets challenged and the Supreme Court's doing the right thing, then that will get overturned. Most of the time, it doesn't make it that far because it either gets overturned at a lower level or people don't challenge it because they don't find it a waste of they don't want to spend the money and time to challenge something like that. So while we're talking mostly about, federal, Joe Biden and all them wanting to ban guns, states have already done, I believe, not Wisconsin, but Washington recently just did a whole big ban on what they call assault rifles. And just like the Bill Clinton assault rifle ban, they put all kinds of little stuff in there, like no bump stocks and things like that. What will happen, obviously, is that will get challenged and most likely overturned. I don't even think it will make it to the Supreme Court. I think the district courts will overturn it.
Yeah, and by the way, you mentioned Wisconsin briefly there, although you corrected yourself. But Wisconsin tried to plug the loophole that evidently they thought Kyle had gotten away with, and it was actually voted down. So whatever stipulations that Kyle used, there were 3 of them, is still the law in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I think you're finding where, it's dominantly red, the gun laws are going to get passed where it's dominantly blue. They're going to get shot down. So, or did I reverse those colors?
Right. And by the way, we mentioned the AR-15, and I have a video up on that particular rifle and the way the public reacts to it. And I think it's kind of important here because the public has kind of played the AR-15 as this absolutely horrendous, dangerous weapon, when in reality, to them, it's a political symbol. And I have a video. In fact, I can tell you what the name of it is on my channel. It says, a young man shows up to a protest with his rifle and people go nuts. And what happened is that some young man shows up with an AR-15 and a crowd of women basically encircle him and are chewing him out, basically trying to antagonize the hell out of him because they're terrified, right? They're so scared of him. And this is what I'm talking about. The political symbolism of the AR-15 has gotten so massive that the people who oppose it have even forgotten that it's a dangerous weapon. And I have a feeling that that's one of the reasons why Anthony Huber was shot to death, was because momentarily he saw a political symbol running down the street with a political symbol strapped around his chest and simply didn't even come to think that this thing can kill you. And he chased Kyle down and got shot to death for his efforts. So I think that the way that the public views the AR-15 is really important. I think to them, it's just purely Trump versus Biden.
Yeah, and I mean that's what, as I was pointing out at the beginning of the show, I mean the whole Democrat, the whole left side keeps making it about the MAGA extreme Republicans. They want to ban books for children but not keep them safe by banning guns. They want your children to die, so they're not banning guns. And so yeah, it's become that. It's become Democrat for banning guns versus MAGA extreme Republicans for not banning guns, forgetting that there's us independents and libertarians out there that also are like, hey, you can't take our guns.
Well, this is the reason why your arguments against your arguments for the AR-15 are not going to have any effect. They don't care about its lethality. It's a political symbol and it's a political victory if they can somehow get them banned. The fact that it only shows up in a very minor minute amount of actual crimes in this country is not relevant to them. They don't care. To them, it's like voting Trump out of office. And so you can go ahead and use all of the statistics and all of the arguments you want on them. They don't care. They want to win this. And it's a matter of political pride.
It's very true. Neil, I got something to go on with that, but you were about to jump in there.
I was going to say that it's interesting that, because I'm looking now, actually, I'm going to be purchasing a rifle here pretty soon. And when I was discussing this with a gun enthusiast, one of the things he pointed out was that, because one of the guns I was interested in was the World War II style M1 carbine. And he said, the funny thing is that, you can get those new. He's like, I wouldn't always necessarily recommend a gun like that because it's sometimes harder to find the parts. He says, however, it does have an advantage. And I was like, what's that? He's like, pretty much anything that's wood grain is less scary looking and less likely to get banned. And I realized he was right, because people have this irrational understanding of what an assault rifle is, as if the fact that an AR-15 is made primarily of metal with black parts and, fancy looking stuff on it, therefore somehow makes it more lethal than another rifle firing the exact same ammunition. And that's another recommendation he just made across the board. Like, I wanted a carbine. He's like, here's some other examples of some carbines that just look like hunting rifles that would shoot the same kind of, ordnance that I was looking at for the other carbines I was interested in. He's like, but this one's less likely to get banned because it just looks like a gun your grandpa might use to take out and shoot deer.
It's exactly right. Obviously, if anybody out there doesn't know, the AR-15, the AR part stands for Armor Light Arms, not assault rifle. I think people who aren't into guns and who are just the left who want them banned have this misunderstanding of it. But the Bill Clinton assault rifle ban that we were talking about earlier, it makes your point, Johnny and Neil, that the AR it's a publicity stunt. It's a scary looking gun. In the assault rifle quote unquote ban, 650 firearm types or models were excluded from that ban. And that list included the Ruger Mini 14 and the Ruger Mini 30 and the M1 carbine. And I bring that up because the Mini 14, the Ruger Mini 14, shoots a 223 or a 5.56, which is the same round as the AR and is also semi-automatic. And the Mini 30 shoots a 7.62, which is the round of the AK-47. If you're wondering what the Mini 30 is, if you've watched the A-Team, that's what they used on the A-Team a lot when you were growing up and watching it. But that's the point you were making. It's a scary-looking gun, and it has some kind of stigma to it. So it's a political victory if they get it banned, and they're making it sound like they're going to keep people safe and protecting people by doing this. Yet these other guns that function the exact same and use the exact same caliber are off the list, off the sights of them.
Yeah, and by the way, we might get some confusion here between the carbine and the Garand. The Garand is not a carbine. I used to own one, and in fact, you don't want to get shot with an M1 Garand. That's the 30-06 round, and I mean, I can't imagine what those wounds would have looked like in World War II, but that is a very powerful rifle. In fact, it's probably about as powerful as you're really going to want to use for hunting, because anything more powerful, it makes you flinch when you pull the trigger. So the 223, the AR-15 is, I would call, modest to light powered. And in fact, you really don't want to shoot big game with it. But the M1, that's a different story. And yet, if you showed up with an M1 Garand, they probably wouldn't care that much.
Right. Exactly. Even the AK, if you have it certain ways, it doesn't look that scary. You do other things with it. You start putting the steel on it, and then people start thinking it's scary. It's amazing that they're focusing on the looks, the form and not the function. In some ways, you would think that would be good, but it makes it even more ridiculous because, as you said, you can't change their mind. You can't convince them. And a lot of the reason that I find that they're going after the AR particularly, it's not that other guns aren't like this, but the AR is you can swap out parts. You can do a lot of customization with the AR-15, and most of these customizations mean nothing. I mean, it's not going to change your effectiveness of killing somebody or not. It's more your preference on how it looks. But nonetheless, because you can change out the trigger easily, you can change out the rails, you can add stuff to the rails different than other guns. This modifications that you can do seems to scare them. In fact, in my opening video there that we put together, more of the video, Biden talking, he was talking about one of the shooters. It was a news conference. He said, we haven't yet figured out the modifications that he's done to this gun yet, as if that was some thing that was going to make the shooter more effective. You can take a hunting rifle, a single shot bolt action, and put a better scope on it, same as you can an AR. It's about the shooter and how much time they have on the gun and how often they use it and go practice with it, more so than it is the modifications you can make to it.
Right. So I guess the question then becomes, where do we want to take this from here? I have some stuff, for example, to bring up. I have a clip specifically discussing the Charleston shooting, which is ironic to me because someone had challenged me because they said I don't do enough videos, from a leftist perspective for them. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, why don't you ever talk about the Charleston shooting? Because, of course, they love the Charleston shooting because it brings up their white supremacist boogeyman that they want so much. But there's an interesting point about the Charleston shooting that the person that I was talking to about it was not aware of. And I'd like to take a moment to expose the audience to it if you guys are up for it.
Okay.
So I have a clip here of a documentary. It was actually a Showtime documentary specifically on the topic of mass shootings. And I pulled up this clip because there's an interesting point specifically about what happened in Charleston and how it could have gone very differently.
Then the group stood to do a closing prayer. When they stood up, they closed their eyes. And as they closed their eyes, he pulled out his gun and he shot Clemente Pinckney, the church's pastor, first. And then he began to go around the 4 tables. The people at the tables, for the most part, dove underneath them for protection. However, Reverend Simmons, who was an Army veteran, stood and in his commanding voice said, "What have you done to my pastor? I need to check on my pastor." At which point Roof shot him. Dan Simmons stumbled toward the exit and Roof shot him several more times and he fell right next to the door to get out of the church. His son later testified about wondering why his father did not pull the gun that he normally had on him. It turned out that Reverend Simmons had left his gun in his car. And so there is some speculation that he was trying to get to his car to get to his gun.
So think about how that changes the entire dynamic of discussing the Charleston shooting. Because nobody brings this up, although it was reported by mainstream media. And I have an article that I want to pull up here real quick on this topic, but in case anybody's doubting the veracity. But when the leftists discuss the Charleston shooting, they never bring up this topic. And it's reported here by ABC News. Reverend Simmons left his handgun in his car on the night of the Emanuel shooting, says son in testimony, specifically stating, I'm going to go ahead and blow this up so you guys can read along with me. But it says, Daniel Simmons carried a small pistol with him everywhere, even to church on Sundays and Bible studies on Wednesday nights. If he had been armed, then I honestly believe that shooting probably would have went a lot more like the one in Texas, which I also have an article for, where a mass shooter showed up at a Texas church and then people stood up and he got gunned down in seconds the moment he opened fire on the people in that church. I've seen footage of that. I wasn't able to find it for this clip, but it was actually, it's an unfortunate situation, but honestly, that guy was dead as fried chicken the moment he opened fire. And there were several other examples of, the other circumstances like this. There was another one, ironically, wherein a mass shooter who happened to be African-American was shot by another African-American who put an end to the mass shooting. And that would be this one here. And people don't discuss these. These don't get any kind of attention. It doesn't help, of course, that the left is obsessed right now with insisting that all mass shooters are far-right, straight male Christian conservatives. But again, this guy showed up at a party and
apparently NRA members too, which not a single one have been, but go ahead.
And this guy had gotten his AR illegally and he showed up at a party and started opening fire. And this girl pulled out her pistol and had him dead in seconds. There's another one I didn't have a link for, but I can provide these to anybody who wants to see them in the chat. Where somebody had a gun and he started opening fire at a mall and then somebody pulled out a gun and shot them too. And one of the reasons why that one doesn't get brought up is, again, it was an African-American person. And I want to be very clear for the audience. I'm not in any way suggesting that African-Americans are more predisposed to committing mass shootings. The issue is that they were trying to make it a racial issue, and they still do. They try to bring this up, and they very selectively don't want to talk about it anytime a person of color does any of these things. And they say that they do that supposedly to try to protect people from harmful stereotypes, while they're actively trying to stereotype straight white males or MAGA hunting NRA. They're trying to create a stereotype. So they don't want anything to interfere with that. But anyway, I've said a lot, and I showed that clip. I give you guys an opportunity to talk about it.
Well, I think that's the point that you made, that one, they don't bring up anytime the good guy with the gun saves the day. It's not on the news. They don't talk about it for 3 days long like they do a mass shooter. They use the cops that didn't go into the school and stood outside and let it happen, and made it sound like, well, I wouldn't go in either with a guy with an AR-15. So they didn't even, put down the cops for not going into the school. It's like the left is bad guy with gun, okay, good guy with gun, bad. They completely reverse it. And more so, the video that I had at the opening with Susan Hupp, she was in the 90s. What she was testifying on was she was at a diner when a shooter came in. And as she said, she left her gun in the car because of the laws. That guy left his gun in the car. I don't know if it was because of the laws or he just happened to do that. But in the case of the point I'm trying to make is, anytime they regulate this, that's all they're affecting is the law-abiding citizens. The criminals do not care about the law. In fact, they are more happy to know that we cannot be armed or cannot possess a firearm to protect ourselves. So any law that they make, and, like I said, if I can't convince you at the end of the show or during the show, then nothing will. But keep that in mind. Picture that you're at a place and a shooter comes in there, and somebody could have stopped that shooter from shooting you or your relative, but because you supported a law that made them not allowed to have that gun with them that day, they couldn't do it. So now you are mortally wounded, or somebody was shot and killed, and you supported a law that allowed it so the good guy with the gun couldn't save the day. The cops' time to get there from the time they're called, any shooter, even without a semi-automatic, can wreak a lot of havoc. A person with a knife can wreak a lot of havoc from the time it takes to call it in to the cops to show up and do something. It's the good guys there on the spot that have the ability to stop it right then and there. As you said, you can make them as dead as, what'd you say, fried chicken?
Yeah. It's a term from Pulp Fiction, but yes.
Yeah.
Johnny, did you want to comment on what we just looked at?
Well, I mean, the thing that drives me crazy is that you see a person, let's say, open carrying an AR-15, they got it strapped to their back and they're inside a grocery store. I find it kind of odd. I mean, I own a couple of AR-15s, but I don't carry them around in public.
Yeah.
But
same.
whatever the case, that doesn't worry me, because I figure that if there's somebody that's going to open fire on people, it's not going to be the person who's got the AR-15 strapped to his back and he's wandering around checking out the tomatoes. All right. And in fact, it's the guy with the backpack that scares the hell out of me. And, he walks in, he's got a backpack. Now, keep in mind, when I say scares the hell out of me, that doesn't mean I'm scared every time I see that. I'm just saying that at least in a kind of literary sense, if the person is walking in with a backpack, they are far, far more likely to be the ones to open fire on people in there than the person walking in with an AR-15. In fact, I cannot think of any time in history where anybody who walked in was just open carrying an AR-15 like that ever hurt anyone.
I can't either.
Yeah, I mean, really, seriously. I mean, they're just going to get out of their car and run in and start shooting people. They're not going to go around, checking out the Campbell's soup selections. So this is where you have a lot of phony, fake hysteria,
I agree. And like I said at the beginning, they're going after the AR-15, which is less than 3%. It's handguns that are used, and for logical reasons. You can conceal that really easy until you're ready to use it. An AR-15, somebody can see you coming, with it. It's not as easy to conceal unless you're, wearing a trench coat like Neo from the Matrix, which I haven't seen a shooter really doing that either. Again, not that I think we want to ban handguns, but the point here is it is selective and it has nothing to do with safety, with public safety. It's all about, as you pointed out, Johnny, political victory and nothing else.
Right. Absolutely.
And yeah, there was recently on Twitter a guy was posted. A guy who spent a week standing at a bus stop with his AR-15, and of course, everybody was really just offended by this. And I went into the comments because it was people like David Hogg. He was a survivor from the Parkland shooting that became an activist, and talking about how dangerous this is and all that. And I said, "What's dangerous?" I said, "This is probably the safest bus stop in that area right now." Because the guy was clearly there. He was there to make a point, to protest the new laws that were coming out. But the reaction of everybody, my own sister is pro Second Amendment. And when I told her about this, she goes, "Well, I just don't understand. Why would you stand at a bus stop?" And I said, "I don't understand. Why should that bother anybody?" Like I said, that's the safest bus stop in the county right now. Because he was a good guy with the gun. He wasn't there. Obviously, he stood there for a week. He wasn't pulling it out, like you said. Same thing as the guy with the walking through the supermarket with an AR.
Well, I do think that some of that can have a detrimental effect on our Second Amendment rights. We are always under attack. I should say gun rights are always under attack at the state level by people who want to take away these rights. And going around and being obnoxious with them can induce people to take action. And all of a sudden, now your right's been taken away from you. And by the way, I say when rights taken away from you, you still have the right. You just don't have the protection of that right anymore because the government has passed a rule. Now, obviously, you could go to the Supreme Court and win it, but as you said earlier, most of the time people just don't want to go to that. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have your gun right taken away from you. So I would suggest that if you have an AR-15, leave it at home, and unless you have a really good reason. If you really need protection, carry a handgun with you. An AR-15 strapped on your back is really not much of a good weapon to have in a case like this. You really need something you could pull out really quick, and
not
go ahead.
Not cause more damage. I mean, you shoot an AR up close in a crowd, you're going to probably have the unintended consequence of hitting other people. The pistol, you're more likely to hit the target you're shooting at only.
Right.
Let me make a quick
close
point.
Range. Go ahead.
Let me make a quick point, which is interesting because people were like, "Well, why didn't Kyle Rittenhouse have a pistol instead?" And I pointed out, well, ironically, it would have been illegal for Kyle to have a pistol. He could only carry an AR-15 or other long-barreled rifle because of the provisions in the gun rights that were there. What made it legal for him to have his gun? I'm sure that if he could have just had a pistol, he probably could have done that too. But because of the weird ways that our laws work, it creates a situation where he was literally forced to have an AR-15 because it's the only gun he had access to, and it was the only one he was legally allowed to carry, ironically.
Yeah, and by the way, I should mention that Crystal Kaiser, who's going to be facing trial here pretty soon, she did carry a gun to kill her pimp, basically, and they're all going to be rallied around her. For that trial, the gun's not going to matter. Oh, no, it doesn't make any difference. She was doing self-defense. So the hypocrisy is going to be massive. No matter what gun Kyle used, he was going to get criticized for it. Can you imagine if he had shot those dudes with a shotgun, what the hysteria would have been like? So it doesn't matter. By the way, you have a comment on here. This get along to go along bullshit is why we are here. Sorry about the profanity. I don't know if that bothers you any, but
no, it doesn't bother us.
Okay, but it's not being a jerk about it. If you push this hard enough, they can take action, and they will go to their legislature, and they will pass bills that diminish your rights. They will do it, and they have done it in other places. Go to California. I lived there for a long time, and don't tell me that they can't take away your rights, or at least take away the protections for your rights. They absolutely will do it. So you have to be very careful. It's called being, a little bit savvy, a little bit smart about things.
Yeah. And let's keep in mind that government doesn't give you rights. Government can either protect those rights or they can violate and take those rights away, but they don't give you rights. The Second Amendment is clear. It's not the government giving you the right to keep and bear arms. It's the government's not allowed to infringe upon that right for you to keep and bear arms.
Right.
And most people don't recognize or understand the difference in the two. They generally look for the government and say, do we have permission to do this? Are we allowed to do this? That's not how, particularly in America, it's supposed to work. The other way around, the government's supposed to say, do we have permission to do this? Is it okay if we do this? And we've gotten away from that. We really have. And it's interesting. Last show, Neil and I brought up the colleges, and they're very much communist colleges out there for the most part. It's the way I feel about it. And having said that, as we bring it back to our buddy David Hogg that we were talking about, he's off at Harvard, and of course he keeps posting all this stuff anti-gun. It's the guns, as we talked about. So he came on Twitter and he said, hey guys, I just learned that the Second Amendment doesn't actually give the individual the right to own a gun. And what he did is he put up a graphic and quoted Chief Justice Warren Burger, who said and if you give me a second here, he said, on the true meaning of the Second Amendment, the gun lobby's interpretation of the Second Amendment is one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American people by special interest groups that I've ever seen. The real purpose of the Second Amendment was to ensure that state armies, the militia, would be maintained for defense of the state. The very language of the Second Amendment refutes any argument that it was intended to guarantee every citizen an unfettered right to any kind of weapon he or she desires. This is the kind of stuff that they're teaching in Harvard about our rights. Now, of course, this has been, just the Federalist Papers, anything that you read about the Founding Fathers disproves what Justin Warren Burger has to say. But interesting enough, the left is so tolerant. They're for the gays, they're for the trans people. Justin Warren Burger was very much homophobic and had a lot of mean stuff to say about gay people. Didn't seem to bother David Hogg when he wanted to quote him to suit his agenda, though. And it's the same thing that they do. Go ahead.
That's a very common problem, unfortunately, on the left. The whole, I call it the strange bedfellows thing, that they will turn on and off their support of somebody as it is convenient in the moment. Like, for example, simping for Liz Cheney, like suddenly all of her sins are forgiven, even though she is anti-assault rifle ban. Not that that's a bad thing. Probably the only thing about her that I agree with, right? But she's also, all these other things that the left claims to hate. She's pro-Israel. She's, anti, abortion, but all of that gets washed away like as if she was baptized because she talked bad about Trump.
Right.
Yep. And they were all like, oh, she should run for president. And like even prominent leftists like Robert Reich, who's a progressive voice, was saying Liz Cheney for president. I'm like, you're on freaking crack. So
well, I think he is if you read his post.
Well, yeah, I wanted to share a couple things, like one of which is a personal anecdote. And then I wanted to discuss the, because we're bringing up communists, the ironically Marxist perspective on gun control. That I feel that I doubt those kids in the university are being taught this. But I want to start first of all with my experiences at Occupy Detroit as opposed to Occupy Flint. The Occupy camps were always set up in very rough neighborhoods. And the Occupy Detroit camp was very rarely ever armed. And it was usually only because somebody from Occupy Flint was present. In contrast, everybody from Occupy Flint usually had a pistol on their hip. And here's the difference. Occupy Detroit was constantly fraught with problems from the local gang members, from the local drug dealers, from the local, violent people in the area. Nobody messed with Occupy Flint. And that was actually one of my first exposures to open carry. Like, this is how, we've been misled about our rights. Like, when I came to Occupy Flint, I was like, wow, that's legal. Because I didn't know. I didn't know you could just walk around with a pistol on your hip. And then I remember the first night I was there, the cops pulled up and talked to us. And they were super nice to us. And they said that they liked that Occupy Flint was armed because they noticed the crime rates in the surrounding area went down because they knew there's this armed camp of people, like right there in the neighborhood, so I wanted to bring this up, and I'm not going to delve super deep into it, but it's relevant because these people who consider themselves Marxists right now, and I want to be very clear, yeah, I'm left-leaning, but I'm not a Marxist, but they don't discuss the fact, and I think this will be a good segue into what you want to talk about in the second hour about the nature of the Second Amendment. But Karl Marx, under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the workers must be frustrated by force if necessary. And when I found this quote, it was really interesting because, of course, the modern Marxist movements don't like this, and they try to just add context to it that he never said. And I've read articles to that effect, and I will provide this to anybody who wants to read it, but I just happened to find, the very article that Karl Marx is being quoted from there. And he was, obviously he's talking about a communist revolution, which nobody on this broadcast is on board with. But when you think about it, the communists believed that what they were trying to do was oppose tyranny. And so Karl Marx makes it abundantly clear in this letter that his concern is that the proletariat, which he believes are the people, always need to be armed to protect themselves in the event that the bourgeoisie or the wealthy that they think are basically any tyrants might show up and try to cause them problems. And he understood, for example, that even within his socialist communist utopia, that you would always have to be vigilant for the possibility that some kind of tyranny might rise. And the reason that this is extremely relevant to me, and I feel it is a great segue into what we're going to be discussing about the Founding Fathers and the origins of the Second Amendment, is it's a very similar understanding that the citizenry needs to be armed in the event that a tyrant tries to take control of their government. And nobody gets taught about this. They're very selective about how they go about teaching Marxism in college. And of course, they also don't bring any of the true history up about anything that happened in the Soviet Union. And I got kids right now who are gushing over China like it's the most beautiful place ever. Even though China is known to be a racist country, it's known to have all kinds of other problems that none of these kids would ever want to live with. But they're being lied to. I talked about this with Lear Keith. She's one of my leftist guests that I had not long ago. And she's like, how the hell are these people becoming Stalinists? Who the hell is telling them this stuff?
Harvard.
Right. Apparently so. But if you read this article in context, he makes it abundantly clear. He's, because what the Marxists have tried to do as far as damage control about this since then is they try to say, well, he would have been for taking everybody's guns away afterwards. And I'm like, it's interesting that you don't have any quotes where he's saying that, because he doesn't say that in this article. He makes it abundantly clear that the people, his proletariat, has to be armed at all times to protect themselves from tyranny. He understood, and it's the same concept, ironically, that comes that the far right is then, and just regular right, is going to quote regarding the Founding Fathers and the need for people to be armed to protect themselves from the possible tyranny that could arise in their government.
Right. And probably the only thing Karl Marx and I might agree on here. I don't know.
Right.
As I keep talking about the Democrats, I do want to make it clear that all the legislation that passed, it takes both parties. Why I'm picking on the Democrats is because right now, everywhere I go, they're very vocal about all this. And of course, Joe Biden is up there right now, probably at least once a day on social media talking about common sense gun control legislation. The Democrats sit there and they'll tell you Fox News are liars. Fox News are liars. We hate Fox News. They lie. They should be banned. Then Fox News puts out a poll that says 80% of gun owners support gun control. And all of a sudden they share the poll like it's the holy grail of their argument. And I'm like, well, I thought Fox News was liars. Which I do believe when they put a poll up like that they are liars. But when you think about it, and we'll go in here, I've got a graphic, before we get into the history and talk about the Founding Fathers. Sure. And I'm sure Johnny can appreciate this and want to go over it. But what they're proposing, what they consider common sense gun control. And let's remember that they use terms like this, like common sense gun control. Like that's all it is. Like this is just common sense. Everybody should be for it. It's all common sense. We ban fully automatic weapons. It's just common sense. Nobody should have a fully automatic weapon. So are we going to do that for the government as well? Can we all agree that nobody should have it, or is it just certain people should have it? But right now what they're talking about, and I'll break these down, Johnny and I can break these down for everybody, but they've got ban assault weapons and high capacity magazines, strengthened background checks or universal background checks, enact safe storage laws. That one makes me laugh. Red flag laws, repeal the immunity that protects gun manufacturers from liability, raise minimum age to purchase a gun to 21, and a waiting period for gun purchases. Now, for most of this, and I think, Johnny, you probably could agree with me that if they call this common sense, the way they word it, they can get people to agree. People can say, well, yeah, I agree, we should have background checks. I think even Neil and I had a conversation on that. So
yeah, we can get into that for sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now, we've basically talked about assault rifles, and they ban assault rifle. This is, as we said, they're going to ban a particular type of what they call an assault rifle. It's never been truly defined what an assault rifle is. And I think by the simple definition of an assault, if you start bashing somebody over the head with a hammer, you now have an assault hammer. So if you shoot somebody with the gun, whether it's a bolt action 308 or an AR-15, you've now assaulted them. You have an assault rifle. But it's a political word. And I mean, if you really want to know, the term assault rifle actually started in World War II with the Germans and the STG-44. It was called the Sturmgewehr 44. And Gewehr, yeah, it really was an excellent gun. The Gewehr is the German word for rifle, and Sturm is storm. So storm rifle, which was translated into assault rifle. This basically was the first gun that featured an intermediate cartridge, had select fire, so you could switch between burst rounds and fully automatic. It was compact, so it was easier to carry, and it had the combined characteristics of a carbine, submachine gun, and an automatic rifle. It's basically designed for close quarters, for assaulting like in an urban setting, things like that. So that's where the term assault rifle came from. And throughout the years, the politicians just kind of ran with it for anything that they wanted to use to make sound scary.
Did you have any comments on that, Johnny?
No, not really. I think that he's so far right on track. I think that the Sturmgewehr wasn't that produced for paratroopers primarily?
Yes. And then, it turned into the MPs, which was machine pistols. So you had like the MP-44.
Yeah, I think that one sold for like $4 million recently.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, that'd be quite
they have a gun that looks like an AK-47, don't they? Like before there was such a thing.
Well, that would have been the Sturmgewehr because it really influenced the AK-47, and I mean, even the AR-10 was influenced by it. So, yeah, I would say you could. I wouldn't say you would confuse the STG-44 with an AK, but if you don't know anything about guns, maybe I could see that for sure.
Right.
One thing I would also comment on is the devil is in the details. You say this is what you want, give us the details, then I will decide whether I support it. And pretty much in every case, I don't. And for example, we should have everybody carry insurance on their guns. Oh, okay. So if I accidentally shoot my wife at night in the kitchen, I get an insurance settlement? Cool, right?
Or she does. I don't know who gets the settlement.
Well, I mean, so the question now becomes, when does a settlement when is it given out? The details. Tell us the details. And that's the only way that you can gauge these things. These sort of very glossy summaries that they present are not enough for us to gauge the quality of the actual argument. You have to ask them, what do you mean by this? And that's when the idiocy of their arguments starts to manifest.
100% agree. And that's the same thing. From what I can tell and research, what they talk about high capacity magazines is any magazine that can hold more than 10 rounds. Again, to the non-gun owner, this might sound like common sense. And like, okay, well, nobody needs to have a 40 round magazine. Realizing all the things you can do. One, again, a criminal's not going to care. He's not going to put down the 40 round magazine and switch it out for a 10 round magazine just because of the law. But two, there's so many things you can do. Tape two magazines together and quickly flip them over. The guy who's planning on offing himself after a mass shooting or going down shooting with the cops, he doesn't care if he drops one magazine, it lands on the ground, and he walks away and plugs another one in. He's not going to stop to pick it up or make sure that he puts it away somewhere where he can retrieve it again. So again, when they talk about common sense, I don't see any common sense in this. I mean, it sounds like it feels good, like, oh, well, you shouldn't have a magazine with 30 or 40 rounds. Or if you only have 10 rounds, you have to switch it out so you can do less damage. People have more time. The time that it takes to switch out these magazines and continue firing, even at 10 rounds, if you know what you're doing, you can do a lot of damage regardless. There's no common sense that I see behind that.
Dylan Roof just had like a standard magazine capacity pistol. I think they were 10-round clips. He had no problem switching them out and shooting people at close range.
Right. The other thing they have on the list is the background checks. I don't know why I switched graphics here on you, but I wanted to keep the other one up. But the background checks. Now, let's clarify some things here, because you and I talked about this off the air. You, Neil, I think you said you could understand background checks. First of all, if you buy a gun from any FFL, which is a federal firearms license dealer, you go through what's called the InstaCheck, or the NICS, which is National Instant Criminal Background Check System. What they're talking about by strengthening it or universal background checks is private gun sales. Okay. Right now, that's what if you ever heard them talk about, you can go to a gun show and buy from a private owner and there's no background check. That is true. And that's what they want to fix. They want, if I were to sell a gun to you or to my buddy or to my, if I was going to will it to my son, background check would have to happen. Right now, I can give my gun to my son and no background check has to happen. In the state of Pennsylvania, where I live, in order to sell a pistol privately, you still have to go through an FFL dealer and do a transfer with the background check, but only a pistol. Other states don't even have that. You can do a private sale of a pistol. So again, background check may sound like common sense, but what you're going to have is, if a criminal wants to do something with the gun and he doesn't pass the background check, one, I doubt he's going to go get one and alert people that he's getting a gun. But two, you'll create a second crime. He'll most likely break and enter into somebody's house to steal a gun. He'll go buy it on the black market. I mean, it's another infringement on us, and it's another way to database us and what kind of gun we have, and does nothing to actually curb crime. They're showing no evidence that it in any way eliminates crime or brings the level of those numbers and the stats that they like to point out down. So
Johnny, do you want to comment on that before I say something?
Well, I look at this one strictly from a constitutional standpoint, and that is, if I want to purchase a firearm, I have a right to own a firearm. Who can deny me that right? A judge can. A judge can, take away the various constitutional arguments based on your threat to society versus your right to own a firearm and make a decision. That is constitutional. The police denying you the right is not. And the problem I have with the background checks is that, and it goes the same with the red flag laws. You're denying, the wrong people are denying the right to own firearms. And I say to the gun sense people, if you don't want somebody to own a firearm, get a court order. That's how it's done. And by the way, I know a lot of you might be thinking, well, that's, no, a judge can't have that kind of power. Yes, a judge can. A judge can issue a court order denying you the right to own a gun, and that is constitutional because a judge can make constitutional decisions. But this whole thing about allowing government agencies like the FBI and the police to deny you the right to own a gun, no, I ain't going for that.
Right. And go ahead, Neil, you wanted to make a point.
Well, I just I want to be clear about something, is that I think a large part of the background checks you're already talking about that are in place, I'm of the opinion that I feel that those should be. The only thing that I would ever be willing to consider is and I would ask you guys what you think about this, is what about the mental health of someone, and how do we equate how to handle that? Because, most of these guys obviously do these shootings. In many cases, unfortunately, people didn't realize that they had mental health problems. But if somebody very clearly does, how could, I know, for example, the Uvalde shooter was able to purchase their gun legally.
I'll answer that. Court order. That's how it's done. You go to the judge and you say, here's his mental records. Can this person have a gun? And the judge can look at that and make that decision. Because you ask, well, who gets to determine whether this person is mentally sane to own a firearm, to have his rights denied? Well, You think a psychiatrist can do that? Who here believes that a psychologist should be allowed to just deny somebody their constitutional rights?
Yeah, I don't. And, to make the point further, because you and I talked about it off the air, Neil, you were talking about, some hardened criminal gets out. They shouldn't have the right to a gun. My point was, if they're that bad of a person, why are they let out of jail? If you don't think that they have a right to the gun, why are they even let out on the streets if they're that bad of a person? One. And two, once they get out on the streets and they're off probation, off parole, whatever, don't they get their rights back if at some point, or do they never? Once you go to jail once, you never get your rights back. And three, if you're a hardened criminal who committed a violent crime and got out because of a DA or something, again, you don't care about a background check or anything. You'll obtain the gun any way you want to without going through legal means. So the background check is, once again, just an infringement, particularly as Johnny said, when you have law enforcement deciding, it's an infringement on your right, and it's not stopping the criminals.
Well, I want to make it abundantly clear, since I'm kind of being quoted about things I said off the air, is that it more has to do with the fact that my thoughts on these sorts of things are still formulating. I know I'm kind of generally leaning in the shall not be infringed direction. My point about it is that if we were going to suggest, any kind of background checks, I would be more interested in something to that effect rather than say banning guns as a whole. I don't believe we should be banned from owning any firearms. If there was going to be any question about it, then as a society, like you said, well, Johnny said judges, how does that process start? Does somebody have to do it, initiate that? Does somebody have to try to file an injunction against someone else owning a firearm?
Yes.
That's what you would have to do.
Right, because then, the red flag laws, as he pointed out, if I say Neil's crazy, he shouldn't have a gun, and the cops are allowed to just storm in your house and see if you have a gun, don't you think that that's bad? That's swatting for the most part. If I go to a judge, the judge is going to say, prove to me, why should Neil not have a gun? What has he done? What can you show me that says he is not capable of owning a firearm? And I provide that evidence that's solid. We assume that the judge doesn't have an agenda, is not corrupt, and is true constitutional. That's what Johnny is suggesting there. Now he can say, I see your point. This person should not have a gun. Then let's go in. But to basically swat somebody and say, yeah, Neil's crazy, and he's just one of them crazy leftists out there, man. I don't think that guy should have a gun. You don't want that to happen.
So then, okay, so that at that point, well, it kind of brings you back to like something I also said off the air was that, I've been watching a lot of Westerns lately, and I kind of tend to lean in the direction that all of this kind of goes away if everybody just makes it a habit of being armed. One of the biggest problems that we have right now is not that there are guns, it's that some people have them and some people don't. Inevitably, people are going to have guns. And, so the issue that I remember I was sitting down watching, what was it? I think it's called Deadwood, but it was a HBO show, and then I was thinking about a mass shooting that had happened around the same time, and I'm just like, how far would this guy have gotten if he walked into a Western town and just started shooting people?
Not very far.
Right, exactly. And that's what the direction that I'm heading. I just want to be clear that we're not misrepresenting what my beliefs are and how hard I am on them when it comes to my audience. But the main primary point is, in general, I lean towards the direction of most people should definitely have firearms. As far as like when you say, for example, well, if they're that dangerous of a criminal, maybe they shouldn't be getting out of jail. Well, then we've got to look into, well, what is the line on that, and how often are you going to be willing to put people away for life?
Well, I agree, but again, once they get out and complete their parole or their anything like that, don't they get their rights back?
Okay, so the law is that if they have been convicted of a felony, they lose their right to own a weapon pretty much forever. And my concern, well, first of all, I'm not even sure I even like that idea, but if you are convicted of a non-violent felony, I don't think you should lose your right at all. Somebody swindles somebody on an accountant deal. Why should he lose his right to protect himself because of something like that? Right. But let's suppose that he has been convicted of a violent felony and he gets released. Should he lose his right to own a firearm? I can see both sides of that argument. There's obviously a constitutional argument. He's paid his debt to society. He should be able to recover all of his rights that he had before. But I also understand that because he's been convicted of a violent felony, he poses a certain danger to the community. Okay, I get it. By the way, if your governor essentially pardons you, you get your rights back. So,
right.
And I also want to be clear on something, because this actually happened in the Kyle Rittenhouse deal. You can have your felony expunged, means nothing as far as your gun rights. You still don't get those back. You need a pardon.
Right. So he loses his Second Amendment right, but he doesn't lose his First Amendment, his Fourth, or his Fifth Amendment, meaning if he gets caught and he goes back to court, they accuse him of another crime after he got out, he can still plead the Fifth. He just can't own a gun, is all we're saying. So we're kind of nitpicking what rights he gets back and which rights he doesn't. And again, if he's a violent criminal, I don't think he cares about a background check. So I think it's a moot point, to be honest with you.
And I understand also the argument that if he was a violent criminal, you let him out. So you're basically saying that he no longer poses a threat to society by letting him go. So why are you now taking away his right to a gun? I can see both sides of that argument.
Right.
That's all I'm saying. Whether he really should lose his rights forever, I don't believe so. I think there has to be some way for this person to retrieve his rights. Whether he gets them back immediately upon release, well, I don't know. I mean, that's
what I said. Usually when you're released, you still have some time of probation period where you got to still report to like a probation officer for a period of time, a year, 2 years, depending. Not always. Yeah, I agree.
Also, I would make it's really important to make a distinction about violent felonies as opposed to non-violent felonies. Like, I mean, I'm trying to think of a felony offhand that's not violent. It's been a while since I looked at it, but like, I don't know, some guy sold some marijuana. Why would that?
A large theft.
Right.
Yeah, like that's different. But whereas like you're an armed robbery suspect, well, now we're in a different conversation. Or convicted armed robber for that matter.
Embezzlement is a felony. Okay, because money's been entrusted to you, you took it, and okay, fine. I don't think a person should lose their right to own a firearm once they get released from their whatever prison sentence they've basically undergone.
Right. So it's still probably based on your argument, Johnny, go back to a judge. You get your violent criminal when you get released. The judge at that point, whatever period, you go and petition the court to get your Second Amendment right back. And you either prove to him that you're no longer a violent criminal and you deserve it, or you don't.
And that, by the way, that raises another question, though, is where's the burden of proof on?
Right. I mean, I agree with you. But again, getting back to the point of the background checks, which is where this started, and people saying, well, you don't want violent criminals to have it. I don't think they care if they're about ready to commit another violent crime, whether they pass the background check or not. That's my sole point.
Well, and I think another really good example of something that involves this is like, the no due process that's necessary when you get a restraining order against you. They're actually supposed to show up and take your guns, and cops do that. Usually the same time that they're serving the restraining order. And the thing about restraining orders is that they could be done ex parte, meaning that the person getting one literally shows up at court and talks to the judge and convinces them to believe you that the person is a danger to you, and you're not even present.
Right.
You can later go back and fight it, but there is no real penalty for doing something like like a personal protection order, and then doing so under false pretenses. And I've seen that happen more than once, particularly if you're in a divorce proceeding. A lawyer will advise a person, usually a woman, to get themselves a quickie divorce by getting a restraining order, so that they could take possession of the house. And then, of course, they can include the kids in the restraining order. And once again, no due process. This is all ex parte, and they're going to show up and take your firearms. And that's an example of something that would definitely kind of lead me to the conclusion of, I'm not so sure that this is okay. Because again, there's no due process, like maybe, after the fact, but I think at the end of the day, also talking about, if we're talking about crimes of passion, if you're getting a restraining order because you're worried about domestic violence, anybody who's angry enough at you before is certainly going to be angrier at you when you take their guns, and they're probably going to go get another one if that's the plan that they were going to, that they're going to come after you for it. Does that make sense to you guys?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a complete infringement and definitely something that would have to be changed. But since this is all about control and eventually a ban, why would they change that? That's just one way that they can take control and take a gun from somebody. So, I mean, wrong as it is, and it definitely is wrong and should not happen. That's someplace where we should focus a change on for sure.
And by the way, just so that everybody is on the same page as far as what this all means, they do go in and they take your firearms. There is a certain time for which they have to prove that they can keep them. So it's not quite like they could just walk in, grab your firearms, and then you lose them, totally.
Right.
The other one is, do you guys remember about a few years ago where they actually ordered a person to turn in his guns because of a domestic violence deal? He refused to do it, so she broke into his home and stole his guns, and she ended up going to jail for that one. This is in Florida. Does anybody remember that case?
No.
Yeah. She got arrested for burglary.
Right.
And of course, her argument was, well, they weren't going to take his guns, so I had to go do it.
Yeah. So, the crazy things people do. Moving down the list here so we can get through it. The enact safe storage laws. Again, it seems like common sense, and to pass a law, most gun owners I know, there are obviously dumb gun owners out there. I've been around some of them, not for too long, but they exist. But a very high percentage of gun owners I know are about safety, and they do lock their guns up in a safe. My pistol is next to my bed, but it's in a safe that I can quickly access, but my children and other people cannot. My rifles are locked in a gun safe, and I have the key to them. I know plenty of gun owners that are like this. But what they want you to do is lock your guns up in one safe and your ammunition up in another safe. It seems like common sense to people. Begs the question, what's this have to do with the law-abiding citizen compared to the criminal? So again, is the criminal going to go out and buy two safes and lock them up? How are they going to enact this law? This is my questions. What are they going to do to police this? Do they wait for, like you said, the ex-wife to call it in and say, hey, he doesn't have his guns locked up and his ammo in a different place? How do they even police that?
That's kind of a crazy law. I mean, what are you trying to prevent? If somebody breaks in and steals the gun, they can get ammo, and that's not a problem for them.
If they can break into your gun safe to steal your gun, they'll break into your ammo safe next. I mean,
I've been looking at that recently because I'm going to be a firearm owner soon, and Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan just signed a law that's going to force us to store them properly and not have ammunition together. And like, for example, I'm not going to be allowed to have guns anywhere where my minors could get to them. And I'm like, well, what happens if my kids need to be armed to protect us? There's a lot of, but also like how you're going to come, it's, I guess, like you said, how are you going to enforce it? It would literally just have to be somebody who had a bee in their bonnet about you, would have to tell on you. I witnessed this. It's something like it's definitely a quote unquote crime that you have a hard time understanding. How are they going to enforce this?
It's like the speeding. They pull you over for speeding, and then they find something else. They smell alcohol in your breath or smell cannabis in your car. They would be at your house for some other reason and then notice that you have a gun out or something like that, or somebody calls it in on you. It's interesting that they keep focusing on the kids with this. I got my first guns when I was a teenager. I inherited them from my grandfather. But before that, my dad took us out shooting and taught us how to shoot. And when I grew up, he didn't have it locked in a safe. He had a gun rack mounted on the wall with his guns up there. And we were taught, if you hear somebody breaking in the house, here's where you go and what you do. It wasn't like hide under the bed. It was grab this gun. And, I remember I lived up on the mountains of New Mexico in the middle of nowhere, and it was just my sister and I at home. Parents are 45 minutes away because they're down in the city. And we heard this loud pounding on the door, scared the hell out of us. And then somebody trying to jiggle the drawer like they were trying to get in. My sister immediately ran and grabbed the phone to call my parents. And the first thing my dad said is, did Brian grab the gun? And I said, yes, I have the gun. And he said, well, I want you to go upstairs, lock the bedroom door, and do this. Made us basically wait there, meaning don't sit there in front of the front door and wait for the person to break in, wait for them to come all the way through. And Dad was like, having kids near a gun is a big no-no, like you're some kind of bad person. And to me, that's just weird because, again, I grew up with them. So the fact that people were making it sound like some big taboo that you take your kid shooting. I saw Thomas Massier and Lauren Boebert pose for Christmas cards with their family and kids holding guns, and everybody giving them shit about it on social media. But aside from taking the photo and sending a Christmas card, that's how I grew up. So I found it not offensive and a no big deal. And I thought, well, good for them for teaching their kids young and starting them early. My kids for sure are going to go to the gun range with me and learn gun safety as soon as I can start teaching them. As I said before, 90% or more of the gun owners I know are all about safety. And, that's the first lesson you get. The first lesson I got from my father was, how to respect the gun and safely use it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up on a ranch. I had my first 30-30 at 9. And the crazy thing about it was that the gun rack was in my bedroom. So it was like, and of course, these were just rifles, right? Bolt action, mostly deer rifles and stuff. No handguns. We didn't have those out there on the ranch. But yeah, I mean, I grew up with guns, and I just looked at them as like, so what?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's how it was. Even my friends who came over to the house didn't make a big deal of it. None of the parents, that my friends that we knew made a big deal of us having guns in the house. It's this modern day thing where it's some kind of big deal. And incidentally, as we talk about stats, accidental crimes, kids pulling out a gun and shooting a relative is well less than 2% of all gun deaths. So it's not even up there on the stat chart. And
I think you're seeing a lot more of it now because of the social media. So many idiots going out there posing with the camera, shooting each other.
Right. So yeah, moving on. We did red flag laws, repeal the immunity that protects gun manufacturers. This is becoming a big talking point for those who want to, I guess, stop gun violence. They figure if they sue the gun manufacturers, mass shootings will stop. I'm not sure that that's really what they believe, but I think what they're trying to do is run the gun manufacturers out of the business. Right. To make a point, the government stopped, this was 20 plus years ago, even longer, that we weren't allowed to sue the makers of pharmaceutical drugs anymore because they were getting so many lawsuits that they were about to go out of business. So Congress stepped in and passed a law that made them immune to the lawsuits. They did the same thing with the gun manufacturers. You're not allowed to sue a gun manufacturer because somebody went out and shot somebody with it, but they want to repeal that. Okay. And this is on Joe Biden's list of things he wants to do. Now, think about that. That is like going and suing Ford because somebody killed one of your family members in a drink and driving accident while driving a Ford. You get to now go and sue Ford for it. That's what they're talking about.
Want to make a quick point about this? Ironically, this is something that Bernie Sanders got raked over the coals for in 2016 because he voted against this, as in he does not agree that gun manufacturers should be sued for incidents like that. I just thought that was an interesting point because they wouldn't leave him alone about it during the 2016 primary because he comes from Vermont. You can't get elected as a senator there if you're a gun grabber. But the main point is just that he felt that this was unreasonable, and it is. It's asinine to suggest that we should be able to sue gun manufacturers, for things done with guns. I mean, we're not going to sue Cutco if somebody gets stabbed.
And, my feeling about it is that if you don't want guns, legislation is how you do it. Oh, the fact that it's unconstitutional to do that? Well, that's just too bad. If the state allows it and the government allows it, you can't sue the manufacturer if they're obeying the law. They're selling a product that is legal. And if the product was used in a way that for which it was intended and state law says that it can be used for that purpose, you got no claim against the manufacturer. And ultimately, the gun manufacturers will win these suits.
It's just costly. That's the problem. Yeah, run them out of business by spending their money.
It's the same problem that we have with the insurance argument. These are not designed to actually solve the problem. It's designed to basically find a way around so that you can take away a right. And they betray that all the time when they talk about, well, we're going to run the gun manufacturers out of business. Oh, really? You have just admitted that you're violating the Second Amendment.
Right.
That this is not about, compensating victims of something terrible. This is all about denying people's rights. You just admitted it. And it's the same thing with the insurance. The insurance companies will take care of these gun manufacturers. Well, you just admitted now that the whole purpose of your legislation is to deny people the right to own guns. And there it goes.
Yeah.
Let's
And
see what they
obviously,
added here.
insurance, if you have to go and get insurance, it's a way for them to catalog and track you, where you would normally not be for that and say, I'm not telling you what guns I have, forget it. But if you're required to go get insurance, it would. But it's the slippery slope that people seem to miss with this kind of things. I hear solutions like, well, let's make the government tell the gun ammunition manufacturers that they have to charge this much for bullets. So the prices are so high that it's almost impossible for people to buy them. One, it's obviously an ignorant thing because you don't know how bullets are made and, how reloading is done. But two, it's always a slippery slope. That means that anything that you don't like at this point, we can now have the government regulate pricing on or require insurance on to get rid of. And right now it might work for you. You might champion say, yes, we got rid of guns. But when it doesn't work for you, when we find something else to do that with, and it's something you like and enjoy, you're not going to like it too much. All of this creates a slippery slope.
Yeah, there's another. If you want to counter that argument, you can just simply say, well, then all those chemicals that they use for, gender affirmation, what if we just make that so expensive that nobody could ever afford to do it? They would say, well, that's unconstitutional. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. By the way, I should mention here that Citizen Ann has showed up. That's Ann Fiedler. She is one of the witnesses in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. So just to let you know.
Affectionately referred to as Grambo.
Grambo.
Both Johnny and I, did you get a chance to interview Grambo? I know that you've at least been on the same time, but yeah, for sure. I interviewed Grambo back before it was cool. And I say that because that's my joke, because what happened is, ironically, I was the only person who got that interview, and Fox News wanted her, like a bunch of other places wanted her, and she wasn't comfortable, but she came on my show, and I tried to get Google ads, and they wouldn't allow me to advertise the interview because of quote unquote shocking content. So I couldn't even give Google my money to advertise the conversation. And we didn't show any footage. Like, there was nothing graphic. It was just she and I talking about what took place that evening. But it's great always to have her here. And, I'm sure that we'll be seeing her on future panels as well, going forward, along with Photo Chat and, some of the other people that we've interviewed. But anyway, go ahead and continue.
Okay, well, the next two I'm going to combine together so we can get through this. But there's raise the minimum age to purchase to 21 and a waiting period for gun purchases. Obviously, the raising the age, again, the amount of people under the age of 21 committing these crimes, if you take out gang violence, is very, very, the stat doesn't even make the charts again. And what gangster cares whether you raise the age to 21 or not? The waiting period for gun purchase, anybody, particularly a female who has had a stalker and then had to do a waiting period to get a gun, will tell you right now that no way that they want a waiting period for gun purchase. And it's being touted as this will give you time to cool off and think about it. Again, throughout all these, as we talk about, I don't see the common sense. I don't see where a person with intent, with criminal intent to do something particularly bad with a gun, cares about any of this. They will find a way to get it, they will use it, and they won't care about your age limit or your waiting period. And of course, again, if you're going to raise the age to own a gun to 21, then we have to raise conscription, the selective service to 21. We have to raise voting to 21. It's these arbitrary numbers. You can do this at 18, but you can't do this until you're 21. That's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. As Johnny and I said, we owned our guns since we were kids. There's nothing to show that younger people have any activity of crime or contribute to these stats of mass crime.
I'd be interested to know. Honestly, I don't even think, other than the recent trans shooter, how many of these mass shooters are really, are super young? I don't know.
They're not there. That's what I said. Take out gang violence, take out, the shootings from gangs, and people under 21 aren't there. They're not even a stat.
Right. That's kind of what I figured. Go ahead, Johnny.
Well, we already have age limits in place. From a constitutional argument, I'm not sure where it goes from there, because you're basically just changing an age for one to the other. I kind of feel that 18 should be for everything, right? At 18, you're an adult, so you get all that which an adult is allowed to do. And
Correct.
if you want to raise it to 21, as you mentioned, well, okay. What about the vote? Oh, well, now we can't do that. Well, okay. You know, the person's not responsible enough to own a gun, but they're responsible enough to vote. All right. You know, again, you have to ask, what is the purpose of this? Is this purpose really designed to make for a safer society, or is this just trying to take away people's rights?
Right. And I mean, I think that's what obviously the three of us have clearly determined this is about taking away people's rights. But the point of breaking it down is, you know, as we talked about on the breakdown, they can sit there and they use these words, common sense gun control. And if you're not a gun owner and you don't know much about guns and they talk about these things, you can sit there and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. And so when they say 80% of these people support common sense gun control, well, these are just bullet points. And they, as you pointed out, Johnny, they don't really go into more details about what they are and why they're there. And so again, it makes people think, oh, well, yeah, I guess that's common sense. You know, what do I have to say? 21 years old. That makes sense to me. You know, okay, safe storage. Yeah, that's common sense. I mean, you know, oh, no magazine over 10 rounds. Oh, common sense. It doesn't point out, doesn't do anything to show where that will curb or stop crime in any way. And therefore, all that is in our minds, as we've discussed, is an infringement on our right. And, you know, clearly a violation of the Second Amendment. The question becomes, if anybody's listening who at first thought, oh, okay, well, common sense gun control sounds logical to me. Now are they going, well, let me think about this. Yeah, you're right. There's no common sense behind this. Or are they holding their position as we suspect they would?
By the way, I also should mention that a lot of these common sense gun laws are really just very pro-rich, right? Because, for example, gun safes. We're going to require gun safes. I can afford a gun safe, right? I own one. But, I mean, people who have money can afford to abide by these things. But a person who is poor, and by the way, they typically live in very rough neighborhoods, they're the ones that need a gun to protect themselves. They can't afford a gun safe. Gun safes are expensive, right? They can
thousands of dollars, right?
Well, you can get cheap ones, but still, Johnny's point is still on. I mean,
well,
you know,
and insurance, right? Who's going to be paying the high insurance rates? It's not going to be the gun collector who lives in a $1 million house who's got 40 guns to his name. It's going to be the real poor person who can barely afford his gun. And since he lives in a very rough area, his guns are more likely to be used and stolen. They're the ones that are going to have to pay the prices, and they're the least ones that can afford it.
well, and I would argue that gun control is rooted in racism. I mean, that's, as you're pointing out without saying it, is basically what's happening here.
Oh, by the way, though, Carol Anderson, who's one of these speakers, she's going around. Her claim is that the Second Amendment is rooted in racism, and that is going to be the next big push. Oh, sorry.
Right, which is, the infringement on the Second Amendment is what's really rooted in the racism. And we could do a whole other show on that if we wanted to, without a problem.
People make comments all the time when they say, well, you wouldn't like it if black people owned firearms. I'm like, no, I think you should all own firearms.
First of all, I have a graphic on that. I didn't tell you to pull it up, but yes, it came from Twitter. And somebody said the minute they find out people of color own firearms, the conservatives will change their stance. It's such a bullshit statement. And one, that they continue to point out or try to make it sound like every Republican is a racist is all just ridiculous. Again, I'm not trying to defend Republicans. I'm a libertarian. They both have their problems when it comes to, I'm not talking about the Republican voters. I'm talking about politicians, but the Democrat and Republican politicians side with each other all the time to infringe upon our rights and make laws that suit them and go against us. Both parties are guilty of that without question. But to sit there and play these games and just yell loudly that if you're a Republican, you're racist is ridiculous. I know many Republicans, and I know many are not racist. I also know that none of us, no gun owner that I know, that I shoot guns with, that I talk to about guns, cares or ever brings up the color of a person's skin when talking about guns. I have never seen it when we're at the range and a quote unquote person of color is there. Our conversation is still about what gun they're shooting, what modifications they did. We all talk about, oh yeah, that's a cool gun you got there. We don't walk away and whisper and be like, I can't believe that person has a gun. It doesn't happen. That conversation doesn't exist. In fact, it's always it's a club. It's like, oh, you're at the gun range, high five. We don't care about the color of the skin. You're a part of the club. You are a gun owner. That's it. Nothing else. So to try to point it out and make it sound like if people of color get this, then Republicans will change their tune. No, they won't. They won't change their tune. Republican politicians will remain Republican politicians. Republican voters will remain Republican voters. But at the end of the day, the color of somebody's skin won't change how they feel about the Second Amendment.
Well, they're still in denial about the fact that there are, in fact, people of color who happen to be Republicans. Like an awful lot of Hispanics are joining the Republican Party. There's plenty of blacks who are in the Republican Party, and they don't, like, especially when we're discussing January 6th, like, I remember a part of the video in particular that was about the what I call the tunnel battle, but basically it's when one of the real violent moments of the day. And there was a black Trump supporter who somehow got knocked unconscious, and the MAGA hat wearing people very carefully, picked him up and moved him out of danger. Like it wasn't this notion that there's this huge racist element in the Republican Party is just silly. And I'm not a Republican at all, I just plenty of friends of mine who are, and they're not racist. That's kind of old school 40s thinking. And I'm sure there's individuals who are, but there's individuals who are in every, ideology. Like they don't like to be reminded that the Buffalo shooter identified himself as a left authoritarian.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
They even wrote articles in the Rolling Stone claiming he was a mainstream Republican that were totally fraudulent.
Right. If you're claimed to be a libertarian and then you have some kind of hate for a group, and I've heard people who claim to be libertarians be anti-Semitic, I completely rule you out as a libertarian at that point. I would say across the board individuals have racism, but don't claim to be something like a libertarian and have hate in you, because it's the antithesis of libertarianism. So having said that, if you claim to be a libertarian but then make a racist comment of some kind, I completely disregard you as a libertarian at that point. And I would say probably the same. You can't claim to be a true conservative if you feel that way either. I mean, true conservatism is rooted in individualism as well when you get down to it. So,
but by the way, after the Kenosha shootings, they had a protest of basically the acquittal. And guess who showed up to protect the protesters? A black man and his daughter carrying AR-15s. And guess what? Nobody seemed to be really terrified of them. And nobody from the right went in there and said, this is terrible. But everybody's, from the right, or I should say, and I shouldn't make this right or left, but gun owners, they all support this. I see nothing wrong with it. He's there to help protect the people there, and he's carrying an AR-15. Fine.
Yeah. And I agree with you. It's hard to, I don't want to make it right and left either. And I do try to point out throughout this that I'm talking about the vocal Democrats that I see on social media. In my area, particularly, I'm friends with, a lot of Democrats, and a good portion of them are gun owners, and they are against gun control. Now they do somewhat tout the line of common sense gun control, but at the end of the day, they're not the extremists that I see online. But they are gun owners. They do understand the difference between a criminal and a law-abiding citizen. So it's not completely Democrats or 100% Democrats are against this. I do talk about the vocal ones, particularly, again, the politicians, everywhere from Joe Biden down into Congress, that are on Twitter all day, every day, yelling about these bans. I mean, Kamala Harris, everybody has a Twitter post once a day that's talking about we need to ban assault rifles now. And, it baffles me why they're so passionate and why they go out of their way to do that.
Well, what I also want to point out is something that occurred to me while I was watching that Showtime series that we just watched a clip from. because they went over a lot of different mass killings and it wasn't all with firearms. But if somebody is disturbed enough that they want to kill a large part of the population, they're going to find a way. Like it wouldn't even be possible, for example, to make all the components necessary to make a pipe bomb illegal, right? So you take the Boston Marathon, you take
Timothy McVeigh.
Yep, Timothy McVeigh, the Unabomber who just passed away recently. People are going to find ways to do it. The Weather Underground from the 60s, ironically, the more militant arm of that group, which is kind of like a precursor to the violent Antifa that you see now. They're more radical members who were interested in attacking an Air Force base. They had a bomb. That was their plan. They were going to blow up an Air Force base. One of the things about it is it's ironic because this comes up in V for Vendetta because he's using explosives, and if you know what you're doing, you can just do it with over-the-counter chemicals, things that you could never really make illegal. People often bring up that in China, because obviously they have restrictive firearm laws in China, there was a mass stabbing. Somebody got a knife and, went to a school and just started stabbing everybody there. It comes back again to if somebody is crazy enough that that's what they're going to do, they're going to find a way, and as a consequence of that, I don't think that disarming the populace will ever be the solution overall. It comes down to, like I said earlier, if you happen to be a person of color and you're living in one of these crime-ridden neighborhoods, I would implore you to be armed. I would advise you to be armed. And especially, like I said, occupy.
Learn how to use it too. Don't just buy it. Learn how to use it.
Don't just learn how to use it. Absolutely. But my point is that you're not going to be able to rely on the police to be able to handle anything like that. That's why, as much as they're so worried about police violence in these ghettos, I grew up in the ghetto and I remember calling the police once. It took them 2 hours to get there. The police are barely relevant in the inner city, because especially in the underfunded inner cities, like in Flint, they didn't vote to defund the police. Flint is just so poor that they can only afford about 8 police officers to be on call at any given time. And that's a huge city, with a big population. So anyway, my point was just to say that, we have to be able to be in a position to be able to take responsibility to protect ourselves, and inevitably, I would implore all of those people to become educated on how to handle it, use your firearm correctly, get trained, learn how to take care of it, etc. It makes perfect sense. And I've never heard any conservatives say to me that they didn't want people in those neighborhoods to own guns. I'm sure that they would rather the criminals didn't have them. But the one thing that takes all of that away is when you're concerned about the possibility that someone else might be armed. And one of the reasons that the gangs were so successful at threatening people with them is because they knew they usually were the only ones who had them.
Yes, that's 100%. And we're running out of time, so we won't get into much of the history of the Second Amendment. But throughout history, the biggest number one killer is governments. Governments are great at killing people and obviously getting away with it. The genocides, everything happens through despotic leaders. Even our own country, we bomb, we go out, we have drone bombings in other countries. The Democrats that I'm talking about that are vocal, they really focus a lot on the stats in our country and not so much what's going on with our foreign policy and what other governments do. And they even post that these weapons don't belong in the streets or in people's houses. They belong on the battlefield, as if it's some support for war and for government going around killing people. The founding fathers did not trust governments. They saw standing armies as the bane to liberty. And that was the focus of the Second Amendment. They did not believe that the United States should have a standing army, that we had citizen militia. And again, I'll repeat that. They felt that standing armies were the bane to liberty. And so throughout all that, historians will tell you the same thing, that they established the Second Amendment so we had the right to fight against tyranny from government, our own or some foreign invader. That was the number one reason. And it's being ignored. People act like, well, that won't happen in the United States. The United States government would never do that. We're the land of the free. Let's not forget about Kent State. We can talk about Ruby Ridge. We can go on. Stuff has happened. Waco. Things like this have happened in our own country, and we ignore it and act like it's only these other countries that it happens in. So we go around policing the world. We cause a lot of death and famine around the world from our actions in foreign policy, and yet we sit here and talk about, well, we need to ban these type of guns for the children. Clearly, we only care about certain children, not all children, by that statement. And, again, it makes it hard for foreign countries to want to invade the United States as long as we as citizens have the amount of guns in our hands as we do. I know people will say, well, our U.S. military is the most badass in the world. Some will debate that, but regardless, if all they had to do was beat our military, that'd be one thing. They have to beat our military, and then they have to beat us. And that's another thing. And the amount of citizens in the United States that are armed scares any foreign invader. The underground, the militias that we could create are very much going to be resource draining to a foreign invader.
Well, I also would add on that, a lot of the people who sort of knock down that argument, they have in their mind what they think such a conflict would look like. And all the AR-15 owners are going to line up behind bagpipes, and they're going to march into like a military compound and get mowed down. These events are not going to go down like that.
Right.
You're going to have a situation where there's going to be a lot of violence, and the military is not going to know what to do. These kind of, let's say, rebellions, for lack of a better word, are typically very confusing, and typically they're decided before either side even knows what's happening. And I would suggest that the easier or the better, let's say example, something like the Spanish Civil War. And so again, they think that their drones, the military's drones and their bombers and their tanks, they're going to be completely useless in this kind of action.
So,
right. And you got the fact that, our military, they're really here to defend us, not fire upon us. So they're going to have conflict when a politician says, hey, go kill that group of citizens. Now, obviously, again, the law enforcement end of it doesn't have a problem. We've proved that with the ATF and with the FBI. The military portion will have more of a problem with that. And it's not just standing armies that we're allowed to protect ourselves from, but individual criminals as well. And violent crime goes up anywhere guns are prohibited. This is why we focus on getting rid of the gun-free zones. Look at all the mass shootings at the schools. One common thing, gun-free zones. They are not protected. We protect our banks. We protect our politicians with guns, but not our kids. And the thought of bringing it up to the left to say, well, you can't put cops at school, or you can't arm teachers, that will distract the kids, or that will make them even more unsafe. What's making them unsafe, again, violent crime goes up anywhere guns are prohibited. That is a fact, whether you like it or not.
Well, the kinds of people that they're talking about that are going to be more safe are generally going to be the criminals. Like they're concerned about what, people getting shot at school by the police liaison officer, because I know they're trying to get them out of there. And you can just watch videos endlessly on Twitter. I share them every time I see them, of how violent the schools are in many cases. And the teachers are not equipped to get into fistfights with these teenagers who just beat them brutally. And I'm not saying that kids need to be shot in that situation, but I remember growing up in the ghetto, we had metal detectors on the doors. They still figured out ways for the gang members to get their guns in the school.
Same with prisons, yeah.
Yeah, it's so inevitably, as far as I'm concerned, any teacher that wants to be armed, let's go. If you really are concerned about this issue of, people showing up at schools and shooting them up, then it only makes sense that there should be somebody who can answer that force very quickly, very swiftly, immediately. And so you don't end up in all these situations where the cops don't do their jobs. Somebody already handled it before they even had to get there. And that's, I still think obviously it behooves them. Like they're talking about like building these bunkers in the classrooms and stuff like that. And I'm not opposed to something like that. Obviously I think that things like, we should have some kind of plan in place. But at the same time, it's inevitable that we need to be, basically, if you want to be in a situation where you can handle somebody else, having more force, accessible to them, you need to be able to stop them.
Well said. As far as me closing this out here, I would say that the Second Amendment does not apply to semi-automatic rifles, nor does it apply to bolt action rifles, pistols, or revolvers. The Second Amendment restricts the government only. The technology of the firearm is irrelevant. The restrictions on the government remain the same regardless of the firearm. The Second Amendment was not written to grant permission for citizens to own and bear arms. It forbids the government interference in the right to keep and bear arms, period. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's it. That's why it was put in place.
So, Johnny, I know you're coming on tonight. Did you have any closing issues that you wanted to share about what we've been discussing tonight? And also take a moment and tell them what you will be streaming about this evening?
Well, I think I've gotten my Second Amendment arguments out there. So, yeah, tonight in about an hour. See, is that right? Yeah, in about an hour, 8 o'clock, I'm going to be covering Rashad Ritchie's phony academic background. I don't know how many of you out there know who he is, but he has his own The Young Turks channel called Indisputable, or yeah, that's right, Indisputable. He is quite possibly the most arrogant blowhard on the internet. He has a completely phony education background, and I'm going through each one of his degrees and absolutely tearing them apart. So, and it's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's hilarious, the stuff that we're encountering. So if you're interested in that, 8 o'clock on my channel, tune in. My other stuff on
What is your channel?
I'm sorry?
What is your channel?
The Johnnie Walker Dread Show.
Okay, at Johnnie Walker Dread? Or do you add the word show at the end?
Yeah, exactly. And if you're interested in the Kyle Rittenhouse deal, I have probably 300 to 400 videos on Kyle, and including a lot of special guests, including, like, for example, Ann Feeler's been on my show, Photo Chad. But I also not only talk about what happened, I go deep into the law, the whole legal aspect behind it. So if you have a scholarly interest in the Kenosha shootings, my show is one that you really want to go by. I have a dumb arguments playlist that has reached 85 now of stupid arguments that people make about Kyle Rittenhouse. So if those things interest you,
only 85.
Well, I got tired. I got worn me out, right? So yeah, join me tonight, and in one more hour. This is part 4, I think, of the Rashad Ritchie takedown. If you can't stand him, you'll love to hear what I have got to say for him, and you will not believe it. If anybody told you what I'm going to tell you tonight, you would not believe it, but I'm going to prove it. The man's academic background is absolutely fraudulent.
And it's important for people who've been up on current events to know who we're dealing with. Rashad Ritchie is the guy that called for the City Bike Karen, quote unquote, City Bike Karen, to be fired, and is still, he keeps going back and forth on his views on that, which is interesting because he backpedaled all of a sudden when it looked like he was going to get sued, and then now I guess he's back on the bandwagon or whatever. But the idea, it's important to understand that that's a guy who's on a channel that has a lot of influence, and the people who follow it closely, I was in the Young Turks channel when they debuted the Destiny debate, and before I decided to do my reaction to it, and the people there that are completely plugged into that network are absolutely crazy. It's like watching Vosh bots or Stefan Molyneux bots. They don't question anything that they're told, and they do a fantastic job of the wrong thing about the news all the time, and they never do any kind of recanting. But anyway, Brian, did you have any closing thoughts before we're done?
I am going to subscribe over at Johnnie Walker Dread Show, and anybody listening to Liberty Unleashed, I ask them to do the same and give him a subscribe. Smash that subscribe button, if you will. And if you're listening to Liberty Unleashed and you haven't subscribed to V Radio, definitely subscribe over there, because him and I do this show weekly now, and so you're going to want to tune in either way at Liberty Unleashed or at V Radio. And of course, if you're listening to V Radio, I ask you to come over to Liberty Unleashed TV and give me a subscribe. I'd appreciate that as well. And other than that, I thank everybody for tuning in. It's always great to talk to everybody, read the comments in the chat. Unfortunately, I didn't have my computer set up the way I want to, so I couldn't interact the same way as I could last week, but that will change. And Johnny, it was great talking to you about this and meeting you.
Appreciate you having me on. And if either of you guys want to join me tonight as co-host, let me know.
I wish I could. I've got family stuff to do right after this, but we'll get back together. We'll circle around and do a show together sometime soon for sure.
I'm planning on doing a lot of open panels also that are just going to be like current events and not necessarily scripted. So And that'll also sometimes mean bringing people on from opposing viewpoints. So obviously you guys are both candidates for that. Those kinds of conversations are meant to try to facilitate the idea that we need to have more civil conversations on these issues, because we're not going to get anywhere arguing with them the way that they do on Twitch. So in any case, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in today. And I would second, obviously, I don't think there are going to be too many V Radio subscribers who have not already subscribed to Johnnie Walker Dread. We do a lot of content together. But if you have not, you should totally go check out his channel. His production value is usually better than mine, to be honest. And Liberty Unleashed, I've been working on and off with Brian over the years, going all the way back since 2008. If you are a right-leaning libertarian perspective kind of guy, especially those among you who have tolerated my left-leaning views on my channel but are generally right-leaning, you will definitely enjoy Brian/Hoot's show. So you should be able to get to all of that, at least from the YouTube channel. I have the hyperlinks activated in the description, and actually not the description, the name of the show. And if you click on those, it'll instantly take you over to those channels. So thanks again, guys. And Liberty Unleashed is at 696 subs right now. Wouldn't take too much to get him over to 700. And Johnnie Walker Dread, what are you at again?
I know it was 13.
913. Shouldn't take too much to get Johnnie Walker Dread over to 1,000. That would be pretty sweet, guys.
Sometime in about 4 years.
You'll be at 914 pretty soon here, as soon as I get off the air.
Yeah, right. And for me, I've been stuck at like 5,900 something.
Brag to us about it. Why don't you?
Well, no, I'm just saying it sucks because the algorithm will literally, you'll watch a few join and then a few get kicked off, and then that used to happen to Neo Unrealist all the time until they deleted him, which reminds me, once again, guys, if you like Neo Unrealist, make sure you go check him out on Rumble, because they deleted him off of YouTube. We believe probably for talking about the Hunter Biden laptop. So thanks again, folks, for tuning in. We're going to go off the air, and obviously we'll be back next week. I don't think we nailed down what the topic is going to be yet, but if there's anything that you guys would like us to discuss, make sure you bring it to our attention. You can also go to hy.page/vradio, and you can find all of my social media. Come and join us on Discord, where we have conversations with people of varying beliefs. Just remember, if you're coming to my Discord, no personal attack is the main primary rule. You can argue any point you want, just don't attack other people. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. And
Thanks, Ted.
Yep. Looking forward to next week.
Talk to you soon, man.